The morning after the night in Lyon, Chet Baker woke up in a French hotel room with no money. This was not an unprecedented situation. Baker had woken up in various European hotel rooms with no money at various points across the previous 20 years, and he had developed the specific pragmatism of someone who has learned that the problem of no money in the morning is almost always solvable by afternoon if you know who to ask and how to ask it. He borrowed the train fare from the venue's night manager. He caught his train. He arrived at his next engagement on time, which was unusual, and played a set that the club owner described in his booking notes as one of the finest he had heard Baker play in 3 years of booking him. At no point did Baker mention the envelope or the young Dutch trumpet player or the amount of money he had given away the previous evening. There was nothing to mention. He had heard a situation that required a solution and had provided the available solution. The solution had been the money in his pocket. That was the whole account of it, as far as Baker was concerned. The autumn of 1976 was, for Baker, a period of characteristic motion, the specific combination of productivity and instability that had defined his European years since his release from the Lucca prison in 1960. He was 46 years old and had been living out of a suitcase for most of the previous 16 years, following the circuit of clubs and festivals that the European jazz world offered to American musicians whose names still carried enough weight to fill rooms of 40 to 200 people. The circuit was not glamorous and was not financially secure and was, by most external assessments, a significantly reduced version of what his career had been at its Capitol Records peak in 1954 and 1955. Baker did not appear to assess it this way. He appeared, to the musicians and promoters and venue staff who worked with him during this period, to assess it as the available life, which was the only kind worth organizing around. The Lyon engagement had been arranged by his French promoter René Lepine, who had been booking Baker across France and Belgium since the early 1960s and who managed the irregular business of Baker's European career, with the pragmatic flexibility that Baker's particular combination of talent and organizational chaos required. The club was the Café des Jacobins, a mid-size venue in the Old Town that hosted jazz on Tuesday and Thursday evenings and that had been booking Baker for 3 years without any of the engagements having produced a crisis beyond the standard ones. Baker arrived late, which was expected. He played exceptionally, which was also expected. He left without the evening's fee, which was not. The opening act that Tuesday was a young Dutch quartet whose name, the Scheer Quartet, reflected the surname of its trumpet player, a 23-year-old from Rotterdam named Willem Scheer, who had been playing professionally for 2 years and who was in the middle of his first extended European tour. The tour had been organized with the optimistic budget of young musicians who have not yet learned that optimistic budgets are the primary cause of tour disasters. The fees were modest, the venues were genuine, the ambition was real. Scheer had borrowed money from his parents to cover the van rental and the first week of accommodation, calculating that the subsequent fees would cover the rest and leave a small surplus that would represent the financial justification for the entire enterprise. The tour had been going moderately well. 3 weeks of engagements in France and Belgium, audiences that were small but attentive, the specific education of playing live in rooms where the music was the primary point. The quartet was developing something in those rooms, a shared vocabulary that the rehearsal room had suggested and that only the pressure of live performance could fully form. Scheer was aware, with the awareness of a young musician encountering real progress for the first time, that the tour was doing what tours are supposed to do, making them better, making the music more theirs. Then, outside Lyon on a Tuesday afternoon, the van had broken down. Not with a simple mechanical failure, but with the comprehensive failure of an elderly vehicle that had been pushed past its viable operating range by the demands of a tour whose budget had not included a mechanical contingency. The engine had produced sounds that nobody in the quartet was qualified to interpret, but that the roadside mechanic who arrived 40 minutes later interpreted immediately and accurately as expensive. The repair estimate was more than the quartet had available. The remaining tour fee, the payment from the Lyon engagement and 2 subsequent bookings would cover the repair and leave them with barely enough to get home. What it would not cover was the replacement of the equipment that had been damaged in the breakdown, which meant that getting the van fixed and getting home would require abandoning the remainder of the tour and arriving in Rotterdam without the money that the full tour would have produced. Willem Scheer had made the calculation on the side of the road outside Lyon and had understood, with the specific clarity of bad news fully received, that the tour was over and that the financial consequences would take months to recover from. He had called his wife from the payphone in the backstage corridor of the Café des Jacobins, where the quartet had arrived with borrowed equipment and the specific exhaustion of people who have spent an afternoon dealing with something that exhausted them before the evening's work began. The call was brief. The news was not improvable by conversation. His wife understood the situation and said what there was to say, which was not much, and they agreed to speak again when he was home. He came back into the dressing room and found the envelope on the table. It had no name on it. It contained cash in French francs, not the exact amount of the repair estimate, which Scheer had not told anyone, but enough. Enough for the repair, enough for fuel, enough to get home without abandoning the tour prematurely, and with a small amount left over, that was not enough to change anything, but was enough to make the margin of the situation less tight. Scheer picked it up and looked around the dressing room. It was empty. He went to the doorway and looked into the corridor. Empty. He asked the venue's sound engineer, who was passing, whether anyone had been in the dressing room while he was on the phone. The engineer said, "The American whose headlining was in there for a bit. He left a few minutes ago." Scheer asked, "Which American?" The engineer said, "Baker, Chet Baker." Scheer had heard Baker's name. He had not seen Baker perform and had not met him before that evening. He had been aware, in the peripheral way that young musicians are aware of older musicians whose careers they have not studied closely, that Chet Baker was someone significant. He did not fully understand the significance until he started asking questions over the following days, talking to musicians and club owners on the remainder of the circuit who had known Baker for years. What he learned, incrementally and from multiple sources, was that Baker had given him the entire fee from the Lyon engagement, that what was in the envelope was not a portion of it set aside out of surplus, but all of it, the complete payment for a Tuesday evening's work, left on a dressing room table for a young Dutch trumpet player whose name Baker had not asked and whose situation Baker had assessed accurately from the sound of a phone call through a dressing room door. The musicians who knew Baker and to whom Scheer told this story in the weeks following were not uniformly surprised. Several of them had stories of their own, not identical, but structurally similar, instances of Baker responding to a visible need with whatever he had available and then not mentioning it. The pattern was not Baker's public reputation, which was organized around the addiction and the unreliability and the professional chaos. But among the musicians who had worked close to him across his European years, there was a secondary reputation, quieter, less documented, not the kind of thing that appeared in music press profiles, for exactly this kind of response to exactly this kind of situation. René Lepine, when Scheer eventually told him the story, was not surprised either. He said, "I've covered his train fare more times than I can count. He always paid it back." He said, "What you need to understand about Baker is that he kept very few things for himself, not out of philosophy, just out of reflex. He saw what was needed and he gave what he had." Lepine paused. He said, "The problem was that what he had was almost always someone else's money by the time he gave it. The Lyon fee was his. That was unusual." Several other musicians Scheer spoke with over the following years confirmed the pattern Lepine described. A Belgian bass player who had toured with Baker in the late 1960s said he had seen Baker give his last 20 francs to a busker outside a Paris metro station without any apparent calculation about what 20 francs represented relative to his own situation that evening. A German club owner said Baker had once paid for a young musician's emergency dental work between sets at his venue, producing the money from his jacket with the casual efficiency of someone handling a logistical matter. None of these people had been asked about these incidents by Baker. None of them had been thanked for keeping the information to themselves. Baker had simply done these things and moved on, and the people who witnessed them had understood, without being told, that they were witnessing something private. What Lepine meant was that Baker's generosity, genuine as it was complicated by the fact that his addiction meant his money was rarely straightforwardly his. It was owed to people, or borrowed from people, or committed to people before it arrived. The Lyon fee was one of the occasions when the money was unencumbered, which was perhaps why he could give it cleanly. Or perhaps the condition of the money had nothing to do with it. Perhaps he had simply heard a young musician in a bad situation and had done what was immediately available to him without calculating what the doing would cost. Shear spent 40 years with the story, not obsessively, not as a defining narrative, but as the story he returned to when conversations about Baker arose, which happened with increasing frequency as he grew older and as Baker's posthumous reputation expanded into the cultural territory it now occupies. He told it in interviews, he told it to students at the conservatory where he eventually taught. He told it to his children and to his children's children, in the way that certain experiences become family stories without ever quite becoming mythology, because the specificity of them. An envelope on a dressing room table, a Tuesday night in Lyon, a payphone call to Rotterdam, keeps them rooted in the ordinary. The thank you that he had wanted to deliver for 40 years never arrived at its intended destination. Baker died in Amsterdam in 1988, 12 years after the Lion evening, and Shear had never managed in those 12 years to arrange the meeting that would have allowed him to say the thing he wanted to say. He had come close twice, once in Amsterdam in 1983 when he was playing a festival, and Baker was also in the city, and once in Paris in 1986 when he had been given Baker's hotel name by a mutual contact. Both times the meeting had not happened, for the ordinary reasons that meetings between people who have not made firm arrangements sometimes do not happen. After Baker's death, Shear did what people sometimes do with thank yous that have no living recipient. He transformed it. He established a small annual bursary at the Rotterdam Conservatory for young jazz musicians facing financial difficulty during international tours. The bursary was not large. It was calibrated to be roughly what Baker had left on the dressing room table in 1976, adjusted for inflation. It carried no name. Shear had considered naming it for Baker and had decided against it, not out of reluctance to honor him, but because the anonymity seemed more consistent with what Baker had done. The point of the original act was that it asked for nothing, no acknowledgement, no gratitude, no name attached. The bursary worked the same way. The first recipient of the bursary was a young trumpeter from Amsterdam, whose touring van had broken down in Germany. The second was a pianist from Antwerp, whose equipment had been stolen in Barcelona. The third was a bassist from Rotterdam whose medical emergency in Vienna had consumed the tour's operating budget. Shear did not tell any of them where the money had come from. He told them only that it was available and that they should take it and not worry about paying it back. Several of them tried to pay it back anyway, which he declined, redirecting the offered money into the bursary fund for the following year. The bursary had been operating for 28 years by the time of the 2016 interview. Shear estimated it had helped 31 musicians in 15 countries. None of them knew that the reason it existed was an envelope left on a dressing room table in Lyon in 1976 by a man who had borrowed his train fare the following morning. He was asked about this in the 2016 interview that became the primary published account of the Lyon story. The interviewer asked whether it bothered him that Baker had never known about the bursary, had never known that the thank you had found this form. Shear thought about it for a moment. Then he said, "I think he would have found the whole thing slightly beside the point. He gave me money because I needed it, and he had it. He didn't need anything back. He didn't need to know what I did with the gratitude." He paused. He said, "The only thing I know for certain is that the next morning he borrowed his train fare from a night manager he'd never met and paid it back 18 months later. That seems right. That seems like the whole story. It is, in its way, the whole story. A man who had very little gave what he had to someone who needed it more without asking for acknowledgement or return, and then arranged to get where he was going by other means. The transaction was complete when the envelope left the table. Everything after, the 40 years of telling, the bursary, the interview, the story that eventually reached the people who were interested in understanding what Chet Baker actually was when the music stopped and the person remained, was the world's way of accounting for something that Baker himself had already finished with by the time he was halfway to his hotel. If the story of what Chet Baker left on a dressing room table in Lyon in 1976 and what a young Dutch trumpet player did with 40 years of gratitude stayed with you, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Share this with someone who understands that the most important acts of generosity are the ones that ask for nothing back and that leave the giver without anything except the knowledge that the situation has been addressed. Have you ever received unexpected help from a stranger that changed the direction of something important? Tell us in the comments, and don't forget to explore more stories about the musicians who were, in the spaces between performances, something larger than the legend their performances produced.